Would you pay 10 cents to see a pulsating brain inside a man's skull? Many people in the 19th century did. It was hard not to be curious when they saw the poster at P.T. Barnum's American Museum, the only living man with a hole in the top of his head. A man named Phineas Gage with a long metal pole lodged right through his head. Like most circus posters, not all the details were true, but the hole at the top of Phineas Gage's skull was very real, and it should have killed him. It was 4:30 on September 13, 1884. Dust swirled around the granite rock bed that was being cleared to build a railroad through Cavendish, Vermont. Phineas Gage, the railroad foreman, squinted his eyes at the afternoon sun and shuffled his long 43-inch tamping iron pole along the ground like a baseball player waiting for his turn to bat. The tamping iron pole was 1.25 inches at its thickest point and had a blunt end to pack down sand. The railroad workers' job was to dig a hole in the granite, fill it with explosives, and then cover it up with sand. The sand was the important part. It kept the explosives from going off at the wrong time. Unfortunately, on that day, someone got stingy with the sand. Gage pounded his tamping iron into a hole just like he had done 1,000 times before. A spark ignited. Boom! The tamping iron flew out of his hand, went through his cheek, out the top of his skull, and landed roughly 25 feet away with part of his brain still stuck to the end. Gage fell onto his back, his face a horror show of blood. Most of his friends just assumed he was a goner, but Gage sat up and started to speak. The men helped Gage into an ox cart and took him home to see a doctor. About an hour later, Dr. John Martin Harlow arrived. Although Gage was bleeding from his mouth, cheek, and skull, he acted like nothing had happened. In fact, he even sent visitors away because he planned to be back to work for the next day. Dr. Harlow was not so convinced. He thrust one index finger into the top of Gage's skull and his other index finger into the wound at Gage's cheek until the two fingers met. The tapping iron had made a complete hole in Gage's skull. Dr. Harlow didn't know what to do. No one could possibly survive with such an injury. He did the best he could to treat Gage's wound. He cleaned out the bits of a bone fragments from the skull, pulled the loose skin back into place with adhesive tape, and placed Gage's nightcap over his broken skull. Dr. Harlow then bled Gage by cutting a vein in his arm and letting some of the blood drip into a bowl. Then Dr. Harlow prescribed a purge herbs to make Gage vomit. The purge caused Gage to eject a teacupful of brains. 14 days later, a fungus sprouted out of Gage's skull and he developed a high fever. At this point, his family measured him for a coffin and said their goodbyes. But surprisingly, Gage got better. Unfortunately, having a hole in his head did not improve his personality. Before the accident, Gage had been a docile, well-liked, easygoing guy. The post-accident, Phineas Gage was a real jerk. Gage's friends said he was irritable, used foul language, and was so changed that he was no longer Gage. He also had some comprehension problems to test Gage's reasoning skills. Harlow offered Gage $1,000 for some pebbles that Gage had collected along the riverbank. Gage refused. He clearly either really liked his pebbles or had become a tad nutty. Because of his altered personality, the railroad refused to hire him back. So Gage found work next to bearded ladies and Siamese twins in P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York City, where he displayed his head wound along with his tamping iron. But no, the tamping iron was not stuck in his head like the poster illustrated. Gage took that tamping iron with him from job to job. He took it with him when he worked in the livery stable in New Hampshire for 10 months, and he took it with him when he worked as a stagecoach driver in Chile. Due to his injury, Gage's health continued to fail until he was forced to move back to San Francisco to be cared for by his family. While in San Francisco, he had series of seizures. A seizure is abnormal electrical activity inside the brain. Every brain contains 100 billion nerve cells, called neurons. Neurons transmit signals in the brain like wires in a computer. Some people may experience seizures from having too many or too few neurons firing at the same time. In Gage's case, his seizures were caused by damaged neurons. In 1860, Gage died after a long seizure. Despite a big hole in his head, he had survived 11 and a half years after his injury. Today, Gage has become one of the most popular case studies for scientists to understand how brain damage can alter someone's personality. The part of the brain that was damaged in Gage's case was his left frontal lobe. 19th century doctors believed the reason Gage's personality was altered was because his organ of benevolence, kindness, bump was damaged. Scientists today know that measuring the bumps on someone's skull means very little, but different parts of the brain do control different thought processes. In Gage's case, the damage of his left frontal lobe impaired his emotional reasoning and his ability to make decisions. Dr. Harlow continued to be curious about Gage's brain, even after Gage's death. In 1867, he wrote to Gage's mother and asked her if she wouldn't mind digging up her son and studying along his skull. Mrs. Gage did one better. She not only sent Dr. Harlow her son's skull, but also the tamping iron that had been buried in Gage's casket. Today we are thankful Gage's mom was so generous because it has allowed scientists to study one very cool way to cheat death. Gage's skull and tamping iron can be viewed at the Warren Anatomical Museum in the Harvard University School of Medicine in Massachusetts. They are not part of public display, so you must ask nicely to see them. The skull looks like a normal skull if it were not for the irregular triangular shaped hole at the top. As always, my good being, be loving and caring to each other. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and leave comments. Have a wonderful day.